Becky. I'll pass on to you.
Excellent. Afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. Hopefully, as you're aware, we're going to be talking about BREEAM for ESG in the real estate, and this is part of our webinar series that we've got at the moment. So please do have a look at our website, because we've got lots coming up as well about sustainability in the built environment. But for today, you are with Nuno and I. Just a little reminder for everyone to please mute their microphones whilst we're running through the webinar, and any questions, we'll have a Q&A session at the end of the presentation. But if anyone does have any questions they think of, please do type them in the chat, and we can come to them at the end of the presentation. So, hi, I'm Becky. As Nuno said, I am an associate here at 8 and head up the environmental assessment team. So we have a large number of BREEAM assessors, but we also carry out LEED, wellbeing, well assessments, SCAR as well. So I lead up that team that just that support all the assessment methodologies in the built environment. And Nuno?
Hi everyone. As Becky said, I'm Nuno, and I lead the ESG and Sustainable Finance team here at 8 Associates. We work with a lot of clients in the financial space, financial industry, as well as a lot of real estate funds, helping them develop their strategies, ESG strategies, and implement that in terms of reporting and measurement. And we'll go into some of that detail today.
Great. And then if we head on to the next slide, just a little bit about 8, for those of you that are less familiar about us. We were established back in 2008, and we're a team of 60 plus now, based in London, Manchester and Bristol. We work across sustainability in all sectors. So we work in the corporate world, so that's very much what Nuno's team are doing, so working with companies to establish their sustainability objectives and strategies. We also do a lot of carbon footprinting across lots of different types of organisations, and we've also got our teams that work in sustainability in the built environment, which we've done for a long time. So whether that be on the assessment methodology side of things, or building physics, air quality, energy modelling. We've also got an ecology team, life cycle assessment. There's lots we do in the built environment. And then we've got our own dedicated net zero carbon team as well, that carry out carbon footprinting and offsetting. So they work with our building physics team and the ecology team as well, to have a really joined up approach in terms of offsetting. And we sort of pull a lot of this together in terms of the assurance and certification. So whether that be certification for BREEAM, or for the well piece, or in terms of carbon through the NCS scheme. There's a lot going on, 8. But about today. So just a really quick overview of what we're going to talk about today. So I'm going to chat a little bit about BREEAM for those of you that are less familiar with the scheme, and then talking about the benefits of how BREEAM works in ESG reporting in the ESG world. And then I'll hand over to Nuno, who will give a broader overview of ESG and we'll work together to talk about how we're using that in sort of live projects or with clients that we've been working with recently. And then, as we said, we'll have a Q&A at the end. So, introducing BREEAM. So for those of you that are less familiar with BREEAM, BREEAM's a third-party accredited certification scheme. It was established by the BRE back in the early 90s. It looks at a whole variety of sustainability topics, but very much focuses on the built environment. And I'll talk about the different types of buildings that it covers later in the next slide. It was very much predominantly developed for a UK market, but in recent years it's grown internationally. And the BRE have developed the scheme so it can be used sort of broadly, and there's lots of consistency across all the different schemes across different countries. It ultimately is a scoring tool for how buildings are performing in terms of their sustainability. So as you can see, there's a rating that goes up to outstanding. In the UK, it's very much the sort of go-to assessment methodology for new buildings or major refurbishments. and it's often a planning requirement for large developments as well. So we see a minimum requirement of very good required in a lot of situations, and also in London we see a minimum requirement for excellent rating as well. So it's increasingly becoming a very sort of well-known scheme across the board, and ultimately the other fundamental part is it's a stamp, it's a certification mark that clients and businesses can use to show a measurable aspect against their buildings. So I touched on that it covers lots of different types of buildings. There's a new construction scheme, which, as it says on the tin, enables you to assess new buildings against the BREEAM performance. We're seeing an significant increase in BREEAM in use. So it covers the very similar topics, but looks at how the building is performing in use. So there are two different aspects to that. There's the asset performance of how the physical building is performing and how you can score the building, the physical aspects of the building. And then there's the management, so that's how the building's actually being utilised in use. And we're seeing that a lot in terms of measuring ESG performance for existing buildings. So where asset managers have a large number of portfolios, it gives a really good snapshot of how a building is performing at that point in time. And then there's the refurbishment and fit out scheme, which again says what it does. So the great thing about the refurbishment and fit out scheme is it offers quite a lot of flexibility. So if you're doing a huge major refurbishment all the way down to sort of a small floor that you're fitting out of a huge office building, it enables a bit of flexibility to assess those different types of analysis that you're doing on the building. And then slightly, well, less, we've seen these less in terms of ESG, but there's also a community scheme, which looks at sort of master plan level of how a master plan is performing against BREEAM criteria. There's SQL, which the BRE incorporated into their suite of schemes, which is an infrastructure scheme, which looks at rail and road. And then there's a home quality mark, which is the domestic equivalent of BREEAM. I think it was established about 6 or 7 years ago, and in all honesty, it was a very slow uptake. But in the last sort of 6 to 12 months, we've seen a real increase in requirements for the home quality mark, and it aligns very similar topics to the BREEAM methodology. So looking at life cycle assessment, energy, ecology, whatever it might be, and we've actually had some inquiries as well from clients to look at using the home quality mark to enable them to measure and benchmark their performance against the domestic assets that they're building. So I think we're going to continue to see an increased trend in the home quality mark, and that can be from single dwellings to whole big residential developments. So all of these cross multiple scales and multiple building types. So on to the next slide, which gives you a real snapshot of all the different aspects of BREEAM. So the great thing about BREEAM is it's holistic. Some would say maybe that's where it falls down, is that it looks at too much. But the great thing about it is because it's holistic and it looks at lots of aspects of sustainability, and the BRE are constantly reviewing these and trying to update these themes to make sure that they are in line with the sustainability agenda. Recently, from recent discussions with the BRE, I understand that the next update is going to have an even heavier focus on net zero carbon, and also bring in some implement some more social value aspects, which is another piece that we're really seeing as a requirement to measure against moving forward. So as you can see, there's a broad topic. I won't go through all of them. They vary slightly between the different methodologies. So for example, in use looks at resources and resilience, whereas new construction looks at materials and waste, but they incorporate very much the same topics. They're just grouped slightly differently. So it enables developments to look at the broad range, but it also means that some buildings that perhaps have got some restrictions in terms of the materials that they can use, because perhaps they're in a conservation area, for example, and they can't perform quite as well in terms of them in the materials section. It means they can perhaps throw their efforts into the energy section. So although it's sort of broadly looking at sustainability, it does enable you to focus on certain areas, and if there are key aspects that a scheme is particularly struggling on, you can push your efforts into other areas. So swings and roundabouts, it can be seen as maybe too broad, but also it enables you to push your efforts into certain directions. And also if a company or an organization's aspirations are really focused on energy, and that's the area that they really want to improve on, that's where they can focus on. So it does give you a structure to follow. To the next slide. So I've probably broadly touched on a few of these already, but just to sort of talk about them in a bit more detail, the real benefits of how we see BREEAM, well, the key benefits of BREEAM, but more specifically on ESG. So as I've mentioned, it's internationally recognised. So if an organisation is based in the UK, Europe, or even globally, we can use BREEAM across the board. And as I've mentioned, BREEAM or BRE have really worked hard to ensure that the scheme aligns against these different country requirements. So you will still look at the same credit issue, for example, the energy performance, in exactly the same way, but there is a metric where you can use the sort of country specific requirements to align to the benchmarking for the BREEAM from the BREEAM scheme. So it allows you to, in theory, cover all your assets across the globe against the same scoring methodology. It's also, as I've mentioned, third-party accredited, so it gives you that confidence that it's being independently certified by the BRE, and it gives you that certification mark and that accreditation that you can use as well. As I've said, it's a holistic methodology that covers lots of different aspects of sustainability, and it's constantly growing and evolving and ensuring it's meeting the key sustainability agenda topics that we need to be focusing on at the moment. But the key thing really is it's measurable. Ultimately, BREEAM always has been a scoring methodology. So there are kind of two different ways that we can award credits, as they're called. So it would either be it's sort of a yes or no, you're either doing this or you're not doing this, and you can get the credit accordingly. So whether it be carrying out an indoor air quality plan, for example, so you can ensure that that development has got an indoor air quality plan, you get credited for that. But there's also a number of issues that have a benchmarking, so there may be 1 up to potentially 5 or even 10 credits that you can achieve. So depending where you are on that scale depends on how many credits you achieve. So it's not sort of forcing you to maybe create a report to gain a credit. It's also trying to push people in the right direction, so they're improving on their sort of carbon reductions or their energy performance. So it's pushing design teams to kind of move forward, and because it is measurable and there is that scoring element, there's kind of a baseline, but you can keep striving to go above and beyond or get an extra credit next time. Ultimately, it's providing us with data. So I've worked in the BREEAM world for 10 plus years, and in the last few years, the way that the scheme has evolved is there's more and more aspects where we need to input data. So previously, you would, for example, if you were measuring waste aspects, you'd fall within 2 or 3 categories. Now you need to put that exact waste figure in, or that energy consumption figure during construction, or water consumption. You have to input that figure. But those figures are enabling us to pull out the data from that. So when you have multiple assets, multiple developments, you can start comparing and contrasting and seeing where actually across all your assets, you're consistently scoring really well in terms of the waste that you're producing or recycling during construction. But actually in terms of your carbon, it's fluctuating. So that's something you need to look at. So it's a really important thing that the BREEAM enables us to do. And I'll talk a bit more about it later, but the BRE are creating or about to launch a platform, and they have suggested that there's going to be an increase in those measurable aspects. So some of the credits that perhaps we did just say, yes, we've achieved it, or no, we haven't, there's going to be sort of more measurable aspects considered in the future updates. So we'll start getting even more data out of BREEAM. And as I think I've touched on as well, the benefits are there's consistency. So not only in terms of comparing your 5-6 office developments that you've constructed in the last few years, but also in terms of the whole life cycle of the building. So in theory, the way that the suite of BREEAM certifications works now is that you could build a brand newly constructed development, achieve a very good rating, say a office building, and then a tenant could come in and fit out one floor of that, and they could assess that under the BREEAM fit out scheme. And then perhaps in a year's time, you want to see how it's performing at this point in time. You could do a BREEAM in use assessment and see how those metrics have perhaps changed and how you're performing whilst the building's actually being used. And then you can go to the next step even, and perhaps when you recertify the BREEAM in use assessment, you see that you're not performing quite as well in terms of your water consumption, for example. And then you can consider your refurbishment strategy based on how you're scoring on the BREEAM in use assessment. So it really creates this sort of cyclical assessment route, so you can continue to measure and see how your assets are performing across its full life cycle. And then next slide, please. So in terms of supporting ESG solutions, so the BREEAM, what BREEAM also does, is touches on all these key aspects which are so important and are very much at the front of the social agenda at the moment. We're seeing a lot on carbon, circularity, resilience, also biodiversity. It's a great way of measuring the ecological value and aligns and looking at biodiversity net gain. There's a real focus on ecology, especially in new construction. But ultimately, as I said, you can look at the whole life performance of how that building is performing, and as well as gaining those other key aspects like wellness and carbon and energy. And all, as I've mentioned, all of that data enables you to benchmark, measure, and report on how you're performing. And I think on the next slide, the quality isn't great, so I apologise, but I mentioned the BREEAM platform. It hasn't been officially launched yet, but these are a couple of screenshots that they have released that kind of give you an idea of the level of detail that we may be able to see. So perhaps looking at, I think this is looking at one particular client and the different assets that they've got at different life stages. So you can see on that second graph, it's looking at it gives a snapshot of which buildings or which assets they've got in use or in refurbishment. And the idea being you can click into those and then see how they scored. And I understand you'll be able to get the certificates from there as well. So as well as us being able to access it, the client will be able to access the platform and start seeing their asset performance in a graphical format and be able to get a bit more detail, which will be key in terms of reporting. And then the next slide kind of gives a bit of an idea of how this, we don't know exactly how this is going to look, but this is an in development preview that the BRE have provided that gives a really nice snapshot of how your buildings, how many certified assessments there are in multiple countries. So not only will you be able to compare your own assets against your own other assets, but perhaps if you're looking specifically at office developments, you could see how they're comparing. If you're looking at your office development in France, you could compare it against all the other office developments in France in that year. So hopefully the platform is, the BRE are clearly thinking about the link between BREEAM and ESG in reporting, and this is their first step to kind of help us along the way. I think now I hand over to Nuno.
Yeah, thank you very much, Becky. I was just thinking of a phrase, try not to make it too cheesy, but BREEAM is definitely an ESG data person's dream, because it's got so much data from all aspects.
You're welcome.
Right. So moving on. So ESG. So I'm just gonna start with giving a broad overview of ESG. I think a lot of people will know and have heard about it. Some people's definition of it is, sometimes a little different. So for the purpose of this session today, and as we're focused quite mainly in real estate, we'll focus on that, on what the definition is for real estate. So very simply, it stands for environmental, social, and governance, and it's effectively become the overarching term with regards to non-financial reporting for a company. And I don't know how many of you remember corporate social responsibility, which was quite the thing back in the early 2000s and late 90s. And so ESG is an evolution of that, aimed at managing risk and impact to the business. And then we can talk about later on a little bit about how people think it should also look at the impact that the business has on the environment, social, and governance as well. ESG is also about holding businesses accountable to a higher standard. And this is where reporting and measurement is such a key aspect of ESG. And also the shift that we're seeing in reporting is that companies are having to get used to assessing and measuring their ESG performance as much as they would their financial performance. It's going to be something that's going to become entrenched in company reporting, and so we're only going to start hearing more of it, not less of it. So why ESG in real estate? Well, quite simply, the built environment is responsible for nearly 40% of global carbon emissions. That is in terms of asset class, it is the biggest asset class contributor to global carbon emissions. And so it has a big responsibility to get those emissions down, create decarbonization pathways, and work to achieving net zero. So the good thing about ESG in real estate is that it's a physical asset that we can go on site, we can measure it, we can identify the materials that go into it. It's all there for us to go and assess. From an investment perspective, 60% of global investors are already adopting ESG criteria as part of their investment strategies. And what this means and why it's important is that, for a real estate owner, for a building developer, they will may have investors that are looking for ESG criteria. Therefore, they're asking questions and asking about data and are, pushing their investees to report on this type of data that they need to then make the investment decisions on their side. And the third main pillar is, well, the regulatory landscape is getting busier. Going from building regulations at the sort of local level right out up to the EU taxonomy, which is Europe's attempt at a dictionary of what is sustainable. We also have the SFDR, which is the Sustainable Financial Disclosure Regulation, where a lot of real estate funds are also looking to align themselves with that and to make sure they're reporting the right types of data. So it's a very busy space, and we'll focus on this in a couple of slides a little further on. So very simply, an ESG breakdown with in real estate, as you can see, it's a little bit more skewed to the environmental side. And these are all very high level categories. There are, of course, a lot of subcategories that Becky was focusing on in her section that are all just as important, but the purpose of this was just to kind of give an overview in terms of the main categories that we look at from an ESG perspective in real estate. So energy performance, green materials, very much linked to construction, climate risk, which looks at climate adaptation and climate mitigation strategies, as well as biodiversity, renewable energy, and of course the carbon footprint of the building, its embodied carbon as well as its operational carbon. And then moving on to the social, health and wellness, as well as tenant engagement. As Becky alluded to, you can build the greenest building, but if the tenants aren't themselves aligned to the same objectives and the same sustainability criteria, then that building could actually become less green and less sustainable. So it's an important part to look at also with regards to the built environment. Locational attributes, like how well is the building located? Do people have to drive there? Can they take public transport? Those types of considerations. And then of course the governance side of ESG, the regulation, which I already mentioned. And then of course, like how does the real estate owner or building developer report on their ESG criteria, and how do they present that information to their relevant stakeholders. Okay, so just having a brief look at some of the ESG standards. There are many of them, and we will one day hopefully get to a more standardized world. But until then, there's a lot of choice. There are a lot of nuances between the different standards and frameworks that are out there. You may be familiar with some of these, you may not be, but so science-based targets are very much focused on, as it says, it's a company setting a target that is backed by science, and then working towards that target, and in doing so, they have to measure and report to see how they're going in terms of reaching that target. CDP is the Carbon Disclosure Project. Again, companies are answering questions and disclosing information on how they're addressing carbon in their business. TCFD, probably one of the leading frameworks in terms of climate-related disclosure, and is probably very close to becoming part of the regulatory standard in the UK for all companies, not just large companies listed on the stock market. So there's a huge array of choice, and so there is a nuance that we have to undertake when looking at what is the right framework and standard to align with. It's industry specific. Is it aligned to the mission of the business, or is it purely the regulatory requirements that your product or service operates in? So there's a whole host of things to consider, and so there are materiality assessments identifying which stakeholders we need to be communicating with, and reporting this information is also quite key. So this is just to give an overview of the ESG process, and this will pretty much apply to any business, even from real estate right across to other industries. You start with strategy assessment, looking at what is the purpose of the business, sort of the non-financial purpose of the business, and making sure that that's clear and stands out and is something that the business can really attest itself towards. ESG standards. So like I previously mentioned, it's aligning with the right type of standard that aligns with the mission of the business, that is industry specific, benchmarking analysis to understand where your competitors are aligning to as well, and but also clarifying to stakeholders that you as a company, you as a real estate owner, you are committed to this purpose. And once we've established the framework and the standard, we then go on to finding a way to report, so to measure and then report that data. And just as importantly, it's there to incentivize and track the purpose that the business or real estate company is trying to achieve. And then following that is the verification piece. Like Becky was mentioning about BREEAM. BREEAM is, as an independent party that is verifying the environmental assessment of your business, of your building, and therefore, this is one way in which we can show that we are being sustainable, we're doing the right things, and we're tracking it along the course of the horizon. And then of course the final piece being the annual review, very much like an annual report from a financial perspective. The goal is to get to a point where we're reporting on ESG metrics on a periodic basis. And as I mentioned before, this is a fundamental shift that's happening. The non-financial reporting is growing, and companies are being held more accountable to this. And so that's sort of the final piece of the puzzle. But this process does not mean that, if we look at some of the outputs, that the materiality assessment shouldn't be done on a regular basis. Stakeholders will change over time, as well as, looking at the frameworks and standards that you align with. It may be that there are new standards, or it's an important exercise to constantly be reviewing each step in the process to make sure that we are disclosing and being as transparent as possible with regards to our ESG metrics. So we wanted to give an example, and Becky will jump in here towards the end of this slide to show a bit of work we did with a client that fell under the scope of EU taxonomy regulation. And one of the particular questions or categories was around the threshold criteria to prove that they're having a significant impact on climate change mitigation. So to prove that the real estate owner is actually doing the right things to mitigate climate change in that building. And so there's a list of criteria. We've shortened it a bit for the purpose of this slide. But as an example, energy consultations, energy simulations. And the reason why there's a lot of energy here is because this was a specific requirement on the energy performance category for the real estate regulation. And so we've got there also energy audits and building performance assessments. So can you, as a building owner and real estate owner, prove that you've been doing these assessments in order to prove that you're actually mitigating climate change? And I'll pass on to Becky just to talk about the BREEAM data points.
Yeah, so thanks, Nuno. What we did is looked at this particular client were carrying out a lot of BREEAM assessments anyway. So providing a data point that corresponded with BREEAM was a really simple way for them to look back at how they've achieved the criteria. So as Nuno said, the overall category was focusing on climate change mitigation, but the specific criteria was focused on energy. So we looked at two different options, whether the building was in use. So there we could look at the asset energy calculator in the BREEAM in use energy section, which helps to look at measuring all of the energy performance aspects. And then for new buildings, we selected the data point as the operational energy use criteria, which looks at measuring how the building could perform once it's in use, and measuring different performance outputs for sort of your worst performing to your best performing once the building was in use. So that gave a really clear data point for the client to use to measure back to show that they were addressing the overall category for the EU taxonomy requirement. There were lots of further criteria within that larger category, that many of which we enable to link up with various BREEAM credits to keep it clear.
Yeah, thanks, Becky. I think, and just to add to that, I think the process of so aligning to ESG standards and frameworks, and then reporting on those metrics is always a bit of a fact-finding exercise. Companies have to trawl through the data that they have to sort of understand what's relevant and what isn't. Sometimes you may not have the data, and so you have to put processes or policies in place in order to capture the data. But given that BREEAM is such a well used certification and environmental assessment, it's just a natural place to look for data that we can use then to align to the regulation.
Also, just picking up on this specific requirement for EU taxonomy, the BRE are in the process of also developing their own sort of crosswalk between the BREEAM requirements and EU taxonomy to align them. So we're sort of a bit of a step ahead, preempting how they would match the two up. But they have done that with the EU taxonomy, and with all those other criteria, I can see them picking up on the fact that there are a lot of alignments across the two.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. So we just wanted to focus here a little bit on climate resilience, because it is something that features in BREEAM, as well as being quite a big requirement from an ESG perspective as well. And climate resilience being sort of what are you as a real estate owner, as a building owner, what are you doing to mitigate climate change, and how are you adapting your building as well to global warming and to temperature increases. And so we've identified here the main key points that to look at with regards to climate change modeling. And as I think, Becky, we're just going to go through some of the things that BREEAM can do in terms of this.
Yeah, so the way that the BREEAM scheme has evolved is with BREEAM in use, there is a specific resilience section which looks at a number of these aspects. And the BRE have also, there is a specific credit on climate change adaptation, where there are sort of exemplary level performance credits that can be achieved across a number of different issues. And I see that potentially evolving further as well. So they've recognised that it's not just one issue, it comes into play with lots of different aspects, and it's encouraging you to think about that across these many different themes. So all these points on the slide are addressed somewhere in the BREEAM criteria, and what we are anticipating is that the BRE are due to launch an update to the current new construction and in the future the refurbishment and fit out scheme, and we are anticipating that these may align more with the current BREEAM in use criteria, which, rather than materials as waste, as I mentioned earlier, is going to have a very much a focus on a resilience section. So I think the importance of it being so key in ESG is, again, being recognised by the BRE, and that's how they're going to sort of moving their schemes forward to really focus on resilience.
Yeah. Great. So this moves us on to our sort of final piece. I think we've still got a few minutes left before we open up for questions. But so a lot of the work we've been doing really has been bringing ESG and BREEAM together, and BREEAM providing the data we need in order to report effectively through the ESG framework. And so this is just apologies for the quality of the image. It was just giving an example of some of the things that we were working on with clients. So this is an example of a bespoke platform that we built for a client, where they can plug in all their assets that they've got under ownership, and then click through, and they'll see a host of data features that will be a lot of it taken from BREEAM, some from other certifications as well. And the idea being that the client has got a one-shop platform in to check on to see how their assets are performing from an ESG perspective. And this is just delving a little bit more into what that data will look like a little bit further into it. And so I think it's important that we do focus on the data bit, because it's a good ESG strategy is nothing without the data that backs it up. Companies have to report transparently on it, have to evolve their reporting and their measurements and their standards, as well as regulatory requirements are increasing as well. And so it's have a good understanding of the data, and to ensure measurement completeness is a pretty key point as well. And Becky, if there's anything you want to add in, jump in.
I think it's worth mentioning. I mean, as we mentioned, we're seeing this link between. We're very much focused on BREEAM here and ESG even more, but we're actually speaking with a client who is a domestic developer. We are looking with them to see how we can use the home quality mark to report on their ESG performance, and we're looking at. So this dashboard that's on the screen at the moment is very much focused on carbon measurements. But we're looking to develop a dashboard that pulls in the key metrics from the assessment methodologies. So whether that be water, energy, carbon, to pull out some of those data aspects and look at some of those in a bit more detail, that perhaps the BREEAM platform is doing an element of that, but we'll be able to sort of go into that a lot more granularly and pull out those specific data points. So that's something we're working on, and we're seeing an increasing requirement for that at the moment, whether it be at the building level or the construction, or the asset level.
Yeah.
And
okay.
I think
that pretty much brings us to the end of our slides. And I think we do have a couple of questions.
One question, yeah. So question of how BREEAM compares to LEED Energy Star, etc. Yeah, so a lot of the different assessment methodologies have different focuses. So Energy Star, LEED, Neighbours are very energy focused, whereas BREEAM tends to have slightly broader overview of sustainability from our perspective. We've also, one of the clients that we have been working with is a global client, and we've been pulling together their data, and they have been using BREEAM in the UK and Europe for predominantly across all of their portfolios. They have been using the German DGMB standard as well in Germany, and they have been using LEED in the US. So pulling all together all their data has become a bit of a challenge, because we had suddenly waters in gallons and waters in over here in meters cubed, and we had different metrics that we were trying to pull together. And actually, as we've been working with them, because BREEAM aligns so well with some of the other reporting requirements, they are looking at whether they can do BREEAM across the board now to keep some consistency. So there are definitely some aspects that can be compared against those other certification schemes, but the great thing about BREEAM being global is that we can keep some consistency. So how does it compare? That they look at things slightly differently, and as I say, some of those other schemes have very much got an energy focus, whereas BREEAM kind of looks at a lot of things more broadly.
Yeah, and I would say also it's these different certifications exist also because there are a lot of nuances of building regulations at country level. We see this in Europe. Every country in Europe has a different approach to building regulations, and especially now as the EU are trying to pull together a document which focuses on nearly zero energy buildings. So for any new building that's constructed, it has to fit these requirements, and each country has a different interpretation of it. So it does make data collecting tricky, but it's part of the process, and things hopefully will homogenize a bit as time goes on.